Have you ever been the kind of person who sits down to study for an entire evening, reading the same page of material over and over again, only to realize the next day that you can't remember what you studied at all? I used to be like that. For a while, I genuinely believed the problem was intelligence. Around me there were always people who seemed very effortless when it came to studying. They read something once, write down a few notes, go to sleep, and the next day during the test, they still remember. Meanwhile, I was doing everything people say counts as being hardworking. I underlined almost the entire page. I reread the difficult sections 3 or 4 times. Sometimes I even stayed up late, just to make sure I had tried my best. At the time, it felt reassuring. Like, at least I'm really putting in the effort. But the strange thing was, my brain didn't seem to care about that effort at all. The next morning I opened the book again. Some of the paragraphs I had reread several times the night before still felt exactly like the first time I saw them. Sometimes it was even worse. I clearly remembered sitting there studying for hours, but I couldn't remember what I had actually studied. At that time, I honestly thought, maybe I'm just not smart enough. Maybe my memory is worse than other people's. And I know a lot of people have felt the same way. You see others learn faster, understand things quicker, remember more easily, while you have to read things again and again, and still feel confused. It's very easy to come to the conclusion, maybe I'm just not cut out for studying. But after a while, I started noticing something strange. There were things I never tried to memorize, yet I remembered them for a very long time. For example, a sentence someone said that embarrassed me back in middle school, a song I heard 10 years ago, or a scene from a movie I watched a long time ago. Those things, my brain remembered very clearly. No grinding, no rereading 5 times, no note-taking. They just stayed there, naturally. That made me start questioning a hypothesis. Maybe the problem wasn't that my brain was weak. Maybe I was simply using it in a way it wasn't designed to work. It's like trying to run a gasoline car. By pouring cooking oil into the fuel tank, you can pour in a lot, but the car still won't move. Not because the car is bad, but because the fuel is wrong. After reading more about how the brain stores information, I realized something slightly uncomfortable. Many of the study methods we think are hardworking are actually some of the least effective methods for the brain. And if that's true, then for many people, the problem may not be intelligence at all. It may simply be that their brain has never been taught in a way that matches how it actually works. After reading quite a lot of research in neuroscience and the psychology of learning, I came across a rather blunt realization. Our brains are not designed to remember information just because we want them to. They store things only when they consider them important for survival or adaptation. It may sound philosophical, but it's actually very biological. From an evolutionary perspective, our brains developed hundreds of thousands of years ago, during a time when humans had to focus on things like where food is, which animals are dangerous, who belongs to our group, which path leads back to shelter. Information like that determined life or death. But things like chemistry formulas, historical dates, or textbook definitions? Honestly, to the primitive brain, those things are not urgent. So the brain has a fairly strict information filtering system. You can imagine it like airport security. Thousands of pieces of information pass through every day, but only a small number are allowed onto the plane and enter long-term memory. Most of them are stopped at the gate and disappear. In the brain, this security system involves a region called the hippocampus, a small structure deep in the brain that plays a key role in transferring information from short-term memory to long-term memory. But the hippocampus doesn't work alone. It is heavily influenced by neurotransmitters. For example, dopamine. It's often called the reward hormone. But more accurately, it acts like a signal that marks something as. This is worth paying attention to. When dopamine rises, the brain thinks, this information might be important. Let's store it. What's interesting is that dopamine does not increase when you read the same page for the 5th time. It increases when there are factors such as surprise, strong emotion, challenge, or when you actively try to recall information yourself. This explains a very common experience. You read a paragraph 5 times, but the brain still treats it like background noise. Like music playing in a cafe. It's there, but the brain doesn't see any reason to store it. In the science of learning, this is related to a concept called the illusion of learning. When you reread material many times, it starts to feel familiar. But familiarity does not mean the brain has actually stored it. It's like walking past the same street every day. You recognize it very well. But if someone asks, how many stores are on that street? You might not be able to answer. Because you never truly retrieved the information, you only saw it repeatedly. And this is the key point. The brain learns better when it has to recall information, not when it simply sees it again. In psychology, this is called retrieval practice. In simple terms, every time you try to pull information out of memory, you are strengthening a neural pathway in the brain. The more times you pull that pathway, the stronger it becomes. In neuroscience, this process is related to something called long-term potentiation, the strengthening of connections between neurons. The more often two neurons fire together, the stronger their connection becomes. It's like a path in a forest. Walk across it once and it's still grass. Walk across it 100 times, and it becomes a visible trail. The problem is, most of the ways we study are like standing and looking at a map, while the brain only truly learns when it has to find the path itself. Interestingly, the least effective study methods often feel the most comfortable. Here's a familiar example. You open your book. You read a paragraph. After reading it, you think, okay, I understand that. You read it a second time. It feels even easier. By the 3rd time, the paragraph flows smoothly, and the brain quickly reaches a very dangerous conclusion. I've learned this. But what is actually happening is simply that the brain is recognizing something it has already seen. In cognitive psychology, this is called fluency, the feeling of ease when processing familiar information. When information becomes familiar, the brain processes it faster. And the brain easily confuses two different things. Processing quickly equals understanding deeply. But those two are completely different. Here's a very everyday example. You may have listened to a song many times. You know the melody. You might even sing along. But if someone asks you, write down all the lyrics from memory, you might sit there for quite a while. Because recognition and recall are two different systems in the brain. Recognition is easy. Recall is much harder. And precisely because it's harder, it's what creates real memory. But this is where many people get stuck. When you try to recall something yourself, it feels difficult. Very difficult. Sometimes you remember incorrectly. Sometimes your mind goes completely blank. That feeling is uncomfortable. The brain hates that feeling. So we often go back to the easier method. Open the book and read again. And the loop begins. Read right pointing arrow, feel familiar right pointing arrow, assume you remember right pointing arrow, test yourself right pointing arrow, forget right pointing arrow, reread. The longer this loop continues, the easier it becomes to think, I study so hard, but I'm still stupid. But in reality, you're just digging in the wrong place. It's like trying to dig a well. But each time you dig a shallow hole and then move somewhere else. In the end you dig many holes. But none of them are deep enough to reach water. This also explains a very common experience. Before exams, many people study late into the night. At that moment, things seem okay. The information is still in your head. But a few days later, almost everything disappears. That's because the information was only sitting in short-term memory. Like writing with chalk on a board. If nobody erases it, it stays there for a while. But as time passes, or new information arrives, everything begins to fade. For information to enter long-term memory, the brain needs memory consolidation. This process involves several things: sleep, repetition over time, and especially retrieving the information multiple times. Each time you try to recall something, the brain has to reconstruct that neural pathway again. This process requires more energy. But precisely because it requires energy, the brain thinks, this information seems to be used often. Maybe we should keep it. From this perspective, feeling that studying is difficult is not a sign that you are bad at learning. Sometimes, it's a sign that your brain is actually learning. The problem is that we often misunderstand this signal. We assume that learning should feel easy and smooth. But in reality, the opposite is often true. Moments that feel slightly harder are often when the brain is building the strongest memories. There is a very common mistake when people talk about learning. Many people, including me in the past, believe the goal of studying is to cram as much information into your head as possible. It sounds reasonable, but from the perspective of how the brain actually works, that goal is a bit like stuffing a lot of items into a torn backpack. You can pack things in quickly, but after walking for a while, things slowly fall out. The brain does not function like a computer hard drive. It is not a passive storage device. It behaves more like a living ecosystem. Information is only retained when it is used, is connected to other knowledge, or has meaning to you. Otherwise, the brain does something rather ruthless, but biologically logical. It removes it. In neuroscience, this process is called synaptic pruning, the elimination of unused neural connections. In simple terms, neural pathways that are rarely used gradually weaken and are eventually removed. This helps the brain conserve energy. Because although the brain makes up only about 2% of body weight, it consumes nearly 20% of the body's energy each day. It has no reason to keep information that you only touch once. So the real goal of learning is not immediate memorization. The real goal is to build connections strong enough that the information does not disappear. This perspective changes how we think about studying. Instead of asking, "How much did I study today?" a more useful question might be, "How many times did I pull this information out of my brain?" Because each act of retrieval strengthens the neural connection. It's like training a muscle. Nobody goes to the gym once and expects their muscles to last the entire year. Muscles grow when there is stress, repetition, and time for recovery. Memory works the same way. Another important point: the brain does not like study marathons. We often think studying for 5 hours straight means being hardworking. But for the brain, that's like trying to run a marathon without drinking water. After a while, the attention system becomes fatigued. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for focus and cognitive control, begins to function less effectively. When that happens, you may still be sitting in front of your book, but your brain's ability to process information has dropped significantly. That's why many people have a familiar experience. You sit there studying for a long time, but a large portion of that time is simply watching words pass by. Not because you're lazy. Your brain has simply run out of processing energy. So if we had to summarize it simply, the common mistake is thinking good studying equals more content plus longer hours plus more rereading. But if we look at how the brain actually works, a more realistic definition might be good studying equals repeated retrieval plus time spacing plus recovery. Not studying more, but studying in a way the brain can actually retain. And when you see it this way, learning is no longer a question of who is smarter. It becomes a question of who understands how their brain works. After understanding a bit more about how the brain works, I realized something quite liberating. Effective learning is not about forcing yourself to study more. It's about placing your brain into the kind of activity it was designed for. There is no magical trick, but there are a few practical approaches if you follow the natural sequence of time. Before studying, make the brain pay attention. The brain only stores information when it believes the information is worth storing. One simple way to do this is to create questions before you start reading. For example, instead of opening a chapter called The Mechanisms of Memory, ask yourself first, why do I read so much but still forget? Where does the brain store memories? At that moment, the brain starts searching for answers instead of just scanning text. The mechanism behind this is quite clear. When the brain senses a gap in knowledge, it activates the attention system more strongly. It's similar to hearing an unfinished story. The brain really wants to know what happens next. The limitation of this approach is simple. It won't make you remember everything, but it increases the chance that information gets noticed in the first place. During studying, force the brain to retrieve. This is probably the biggest change. After reading a section, close the book. Ask yourself, what did I just read? It doesn't have to be perfect. Try to recall the main idea. Write down a few lines. If you can't remember, then open the book again. This works because it activates retrieval practice. Every time you try to recall information, the relevant neurons have to fire together again, strengthening the neural connections. In simple terms, this is when you dig deeper into one well instead of digging many shallow holes. The limitation. This method feels harder and slower at first. Many people give up because they think they are bad at studying. In reality, that difficulty is often a sign the brain is actually working. After studying, create spacing. A common mistake is reviewing immediately many times. The brain becomes familiar with the material and falls into the illusion of learning again. Instead, it is often better to let some time pass. For example, review a few hours later, or the next day. Spacing creates a phenomenon called desirable difficulty, a level of challenge that improves learning. When you try to recall information after a delay, retrieval becomes harder, but the memory becomes stronger. It's similar to training muscles. They need time to recover before being stimulated again. The next day and long term, sleep and repeat. There is something I used to ignore: sleep. During sleep, especially during slow-wave sleep, the brain replays neural activity patterns from the day. This helps transfer information from the hippocampus into long-term storage in the cortex. You can imagine it like this. During the day you write notes on scratch paper. At night the brain copies them into the main notebook. If you don't get enough sleep, this process is disrupted. The limitation. Sleep alone will not make you remember everything. But lack of sleep almost guarantees worse memory. If we had to summarize everything very simply. Before studying, right pointing arrow, create questions. During studying, right pointing arrow, retrieve from memory. After studying, right pointing arrow, add spacing. Long-term, right pointing arrow, sleep and repeat. Not studying longer, but creating many chances to pull information out of the brain. Those retrieval moments. are what transform information into real memory. After learning more about how the brain works, I realized something quite interesting. Many things in life do not truly fail because of lack of effort. They fail because effort is placed in the wrong direction. Studying is a very clear example. We are taught that success comes from studying longer, reading more, trying harder. But very rarely does anyone tell us. The brain has its own way of working. You can force it for a while. But if you go against its biological design, the results are often poor. This idea doesn't apply only to studying. It applies to many other things. Habits, focus, motivation, even personal change. Many people blame themselves. Why do I have such poor discipline? Why can't I remember anything? Why can other people do it but I can't? But sometimes the better question is, am I asking my brain to do something it wasn't designed to do? When you look at it that way, many things start to make more sense. The brain is not a perfect machine. It is a product of evolution. It prioritizes energy efficiency, fast reactions, and storing information that matters for survival. So if you try to cram information into it by simply reading until it feels familiar, the brain will respond exactly the way it has always responded. It ignores it, not because you are less capable, but because the system does not see a reason to keep it. The good news is this: when you understand how the brain works, you can work with it instead of against it. You don't need to become the smartest learner. You simply need to create opportunities for retrieval, give the brain time to consolidate, and allow it enough sleep to organize memories. There is no method that helps you remember everything. And nobody actually needs to remember everything. A more realistic goal might be to understand enough that the brain keeps what truly matters. I also don't believe learning should become a race of optimization. We don't always need to learn faster, more, or more efficiently. Sometimes the more important goal is keeping the brain healthy and sustainable over the long term. Sleep enough. Reduce stress. Don't trap yourself in cycles of frustration. Knowledge, in the end, is not meant to prove that we are intelligent. It is a tool that helps us understand the world more clearly, understand ourselves more clearly, and avoid certain unnecessary mistakes. And honestly, that alone is already a lot. The content in this video is shared for the purpose of explaining scientific mechanisms behind memory and learning in a way that is easy to understand in everyday life. The information is not intended to replace professional medical, psychological, or educational advice. If you are experiencing serious issues related to memory, learning difficulties, sleep, or mental health, please consult a qualified doctor or professional. Every brain and every body is different.